The marble was white in the morning sun. I remember that. The monuments stood there, looking like promises made of stone. When the light hit the dome of the Capitol, it seemed to speak of power, of democracy, of things that would last. But that was one story. If you walked those same streets at dawn, you'd see another. You'd see the lines of working folks, a steady stream of them heading for buildings that hadn't been there 5 years before. Temporary buildings, some of them put up in a matter of weeks. The very ground was still settling, swampy land they'd made into a park. That was Washington back in the 40s. A city changing faster than a man could keep up. In just a few years, between 1940 and 1943, almost 200,000 people came pouring into the Capitol. They came for work, the kind of work that hadn't existed in 1939, work that the war machine had made. The city swelled by nearly a third. It was a place built for half as many souls, and now 833,000 were squeezed inside it. People slept in boarding houses, 20 to a single brownstone. They paid rent for a corner of a living room. They found shelter in alleys, in buildings with no plumbing, some with no windows, in places the locals called Hell's Bottom. Some folks never found a roof over their heads at all. This wasn't the dignified city you read about in schoolbooks. It was a boomtown, like a gold rush, but there was no gold. There were just government contracts, billions of dollars being spent on the war, and the frantic building of the biggest office building the world had ever seen. They put it up in 16 months on land they took from a black community. They made it with sand they pulled up from the Potomac River because all the steel was needed for tanks and warships. It was built to run a war that would change the whole world. But there are things the monuments and museums don't tell you. The way Washington changed in the 40s, it wasn't just about democracy or freedom, or the good cause of fighting fascism. It was about something else, something very American. The joining of government power and private money. It was about who got the contracts to build, who was allowed to live where, who got paid, and who was left with nothing. It was about a city becoming the command center for the biggest army in all of human history, and it was about the people you never saw. The black women who scrubbed the floors, the white secretaries packed into hot, airless offices, the construction crews working day and night. They were the ones who made it all run. You have to wonder how a swampy southern town turns into the heart of a global empire. And what that tells you about war and money, and the American promise that all men are created equal. Let's go back to 1940. Europe was on fire. Hitler had marched through Poland, through France, through the Low Countries. Britain was standing all alone against him. And here in Washington, President Roosevelt had a problem. His military was spread all over. The War Department, the part of the government that ran the army, was working out of 17 different buildings, scattered across Washington, Maryland, and Virginia. The important staff, they were in the munitions building, a temporary concrete thing put up on the National Mall during the First War. It was supposed to have been torn down long ago. Instead, it had become a permanent home for a department that just kept growing. By 1940, it was choked with people suffocating in the summer. It was no place to coordinate anything from. The Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, came in 1940 and found a mess. His people were all over the city, like scattered pieces from an explosion. Some worked in rented offices, others in old temporary buildings from the last war. Ugly things on the mall that were meant for a year and had stood for 20. To have a meeting, you had to get in a car and drive across town. Trying to coordinate in an emergency was a nightmare. The waste wasn't measured in minutes, it was hours, lost every single day. For a country getting ready for war, this couldn't go on. The answer came from a man named Brigadier General Brehon Somervell. He was in charge of construction for the army. Somervell was a hard man, the kind of man who would work his people 7 days a week, no matter the weather. In just a year or so, his division had built 50 big military camps and 28 centers for new soldiers, enough for 1 million men. Now he set his sights on the War Department itself. It was July of 1941, only 3 weeks after Germany had invaded the Soviet Union. Somervell laid out his plan. It was a bold one. One building for 40,000 workers. 4 million square feet of office space. The biggest office building on the planet. It wasn't just about being efficient. It was about bringing all the power into one place. Every part of the military, every office, every man who signed a contract, and every man who planned a battle, all of them under one roof. A fortress of paperwork. But there was a catch. You couldn't put a building that big in Washington proper. The city had rules about how high you could build, zoning laws, and more than anything, there just wasn't enough empty land for something so enormous. So Somervell looked over the Potomac River to Arlington in Virginia. The spot he picked was called Arlington Farms. It was a strange, uneven piece of government land near the Arlington National Cemetery. Because the land had an odd shape, something like a pentagon, the architect, George Bergstrom, drew up a building to fit it. 5 sides, 5 rings inside of each other, all connected by hallways like the spokes of a wheel. But President Roosevelt didn't like it. He said the building would block the view from the cemetery. So they moved the spot a little over to Hell's Bottom, near the new Washington National Airport. But the Pentagon shape, it stayed. Roosevelt had taken a liking to it. He said it reminded him of the old star-shaped forts from the days of cannons and gunpowder. It was different, it was practical, and it was too late to change the design anyway. On July 28, 1941, Congress gave them the money. And on September 11, 1941, 60 years to the day before the terror attacks, they broke ground on the building that would just be called the Pentagon. This is where the real story of Washington in the 40s begins. Not with ideals, but with a military headquarters. With contracts. With fear. The building went up at a speed that felt almost dangerous. The site was a swamp. Arlington Farms was low, marshy ground right by the Potomac. To make it solid, they had to bring in 5.5 million cubic yards of dirt. They drove more than 41,000 concrete pillars deep into the earth to hold up the foundation. The building couldn't be tall. They had to keep it under 77 feet high, so it wouldn't spoil the view from the cemetery. So it just spread out wide and low. A giant, 5-sided fortress sitting on 67 acres. The country was getting ready for war, so steel was in short supply. Every pound of it had to be saved for tanks, for warships, for airplanes. So the Pentagon was built mostly out of reinforced concrete. The concrete itself was made from 680,000 tons of sand and gravel they dredged right out of the Potomac River. They put a thin layer of limestone on the outside to make it look decent, but more than half of what held that building up was sand from the bottom of the river. The contract to build it went to a company from Philadelphia, John McShane Incorporated. McShane had already built the Jefferson Memorial, the Washington National Airport, and the big naval hospital in Bethesda. He knew how to work fast and he knew how to work cheap. And in 1941, speed was the only thing that mattered. The architects had the designs done in just 2 weeks. They started building before the plans were even finished. Sometimes the men putting up the walls were ahead of the men drawing the blueprints, which meant they had to make do with whatever materials were on hand. 14,000 men worked there in 3 shifts around the clock. And then, on December 7, 1941, just 3 months after they'd started, Pearl Harbor was attacked. After that, the urgency was even greater. The project became a top priority for the whole country. They finished the Pentagon in 16 months. January 15, 1943. It cost $83 million in the end. But those numbers don't tell you about the human cost. You have to think about the men who built it. 14,000 men, most of them paid by the day, working in 3 8-hour shifts. The day shift worked under a hot summer sun. The night shift worked in the freezing cold of winter. There were no safety rules like we have today. No, just concrete dust filling their lungs, heavy machines being run by men with hardly any training. Accidents happened. They had to. But you won't find many records of them. Those men, they are ghosts in the history books. We know the names of the architects, Bergstrom, and the man who replaced him, David Whitmer. We know the contractor, John McShane. We know the general who pushed it all through, Brehon Somervell. But the men who poured the concrete, the men who drove the pilings, the men who dredged the sand from the river, they are nameless. They were just part of the effort. And they weren't just building a headquarters. They were building roads. The Pentagon needed a whole new network of roads to get to it. Access roads, parking lots big enough for almost 9,000 cars, bus stations, places for taxis. To build all that, they had to wipe out the neighborhood that was already there. It was a place called Queen City, a black community of about 91 acres. It had grown up after a place called Freedman's Village, a settlement for people who had been slaves, was shut down back in the 1880s. Queen City didn't have running water or sewers or electricity, but people owned their own homes there. They had built something for themselves. The roads for the Pentagon erased it. Families were pushed out. Their homes were knocked down. The history books don't say where they went. Inside the building itself, the size of it was hard to wrap your mind around. 5 floors above the ground, 2 floors below. 5 rings, one inside the other, that they called a through-E. 17.5 miles of hallways. But because of the way it was designed, with the spokes connecting the rings, they said you could walk between any 2 places in the building in about 7 minutes. It had 4,200 clocks, 284 restrooms, 7 cafeterias and snack bars. The courtyard in the middle was big enough to be a town square. It wasn't just an office building. It was a whole city, self-contained, for the people who planned the war. By 1942, the first part of it was done, and the Secretary of War moved his office out of the old munitions building and into the new one. By the beginning of 1943, 32,000 people were working in the Pentagon. They managed the contracts for bombers and battleships, for rifles and food rations. They planned the movement of troops across 2 oceans. They read intelligence reports. They drew up the plans for invasions. Every decision made in those concrete hallways meant billions of dollars in war contracts. Contracts for the shipyards in Philadelphia, for the airplane factories in Seattle, for the tank manufacturers in Detroit. The Pentagon was the heart of what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. But it was also the nerve center for the biggest government spending spree in the country's history. Between 1940 and 1945, the government would spend more than $300 billion on the war. That would be more than $4 trillion in today's money. A lot of that spending was managed from this one building, and all of it passed through Washington, D.C. While the Pentagon was going up in Arlington, Washington itself was changing into a place you could hardly recognize. In April of 1940, the census takers counted 663,000 people living in the district. That was a 36% increase from 10 years before, faster growth than any state in the country. The newspapers called it the New Deal boom. The Great Depression was ending, and government jobs were everywhere. The city was already full to bursting. And then the war came. Between 1940 and 1945, the number of civilians working for the federal government nearly quadrupled. By March of 1943, the Census Bureau figured there were 833,000 people in Washington, a 28% jump in just 3 years. But even that number didn't tell the whole story. It didn't count the soldiers stationed nearby, or all the temporary workers who were always coming and going. The city was taking in 10,000 new people every month. The government set up a defense housing registry to try and find places for all the newcomers to live. It was a hopeless job. Building in Washington had slowed down during the Depression. When the war started, all the materials and the labor went to military projects, to bases, to ships, to the Pentagon. Building houses for regular people pretty much stopped. The result was a catastrophe. Boarding houses that used to hold a dozen people were now crammed with 50, 60, sometimes hundreds of residents living in connected brownstones. People with houses rented out their spare rooms, their living rooms, even just a corner in a hallway. The Washington Post wrote stories about families going around ringing doorbells during the day, desperate to find a place to live, because both the husband and wife had government jobs and no one was ever home to answer the door. For the white workers, it was a hard time, but they could manage. For the black workers, it was hell. Washington was a segregated city. It always had been. In the 40s, that segregation wasn't just a habit, it was government policy. The Federal Housing Administration, which was set up in 1934 to help with the housing shortage, had a rule against insuring mortgages in or near black neighborhoods. They called it redlining. It meant that black families couldn't get loans to buy a house, and they couldn't move into white neighborhoods. When they built new public housing during the war, it was segregated by law. Projects like the Ellen Wilson dwellings, finished in 1941 near Capitol Hill, were for whites only. The black residents who had lived in that area were forced out to make way for it. When the new building opened, none of them were allowed to move back in. The idea was to create bigger white neighborhoods and push the black people further out to the edges of the city. Black workers who came to D.C. for government jobs found themselves stuck in crowded, run-down housing. In the early 40s, almost 20,000 people were living in Washington's alleys. These were narrow lanes behind the main streets, lined with shoddy, overcrowded little houses. These places had no running water, no indoor toilets, no fresh air. A study from that time said that 3/4 of the families living in those conditions were in a deplorable state. Most of them were black. Washington had more tuberculosis and venereal disease than any other place in the country. The sanitation was a mess. The outhouses were old and overused, and sewage would leak out onto the sidewalks. The water wasn't clean. The city officials put so much chlorine in it to try and fix it that you couldn't even drink it. Congress knew about the problem. They had set up something called the Alley Dwelling Authority in 1934 to do something about it. But it did almost nothing. People were still living in the alleys all through the war. At the same time, a lot of the new people arriving were women. They called them the government girls. Young women, mostly white, who came from all over the country to take jobs as clerks, typists, telephone operators. The men had been drafted into the army. The women came to fill their places. And there were far more of them than there were places to live. The Washington Post printed articles that were full of a kind of quiet panic. The headlines warned about these girls being on the loose in a city full of men. The editorials scolded the government for not looking after these young women properly, as if they were children who needed someone to watch over them. The truth was much simpler. Thousands of women were living in crowded rooms, working long hours in hot offices, just trying to get by on a clerk's wages. The work they did was vital. They handled the paperwork that made the war run. Every contract, every order for supplies, every plan for moving troops created papers that had to be typed and filed and checked. Without these government girls, the whole war machine would have stopped. But they were treated like a problem. A housing problem, a social problem, a moral problem. Hollywood even made movies about it, trying to make it all seem charming. Films like The More the Merrier in 1943 and Government Girl and The Doughgirls in 1944. They showed the housing shortage in Washington as a kind of romantic comedy. In the movies, the overcrowding led to people meeting and falling in love. The reality, the sewage in the streets, the sickness, the families having to sleep in shifts, that part never made it onto the screen. The government did try to do something. Starting in 1942, they began to build temporary housing. By the time the war was over, they had put up about 45,000 temporary units and started work on 18,000 permanent ones. It wasn't nearly enough, and a lot of the new housing was badly built. Some new buildings in Alexandria, Virginia, were put up without proper drainage. Sewage would back up into the main water reservoir. The officials dealt with it by pouring more chlorine into the water, which made it unsafe to drink. That problem went on for years. And almost all of the new permanent housing was just for white workers. Black workers were mostly left out. It was only after a lot of pushing and lobbying that the government agreed to set aside a small number of units for black families. And even then, those units were segregated, built in places far from downtown and often not as well made. This wasn't a mistake. It was the policy. The federal housing programs in the 40s were set up specifically to create and maintain segregation between the races. The FHA wouldn't insure loans for integrated housing projects. Builders who wanted government money had to put clauses in their property deeds that made it illegal to sell or rent to black families. The public housing authorities built separate projects for whites and for blacks, making sure they would never live in the same buildings or the same neighborhoods. The effects of this would last for decades. White families who bought homes in the 40s and 50s with those FHA loans saw their wealth grow as the value of their houses went up. Black families who couldn't get the same loans, stayed renters, or were stuck in redline neighborhoods where property values never increased. By the 1960s, the difference in wealth was enormous. But back in the 40s, in the middle of it all, these policies were described as being practical, necessary, even kind. After all, the government was building some housing. Wasn't that something? For tens of thousands of black workers, the answer was no. By 1943, the change was complete. Washington, D.C. was now the administrative capital of a world at war. Inside the Pentagon, 32,000 people coordinated military operations across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. They managed supply lines that reached from Detroit all the way to Guadalcanal. They processed intelligence coming from countries under occupation. They drafted the plans for battle and they handed out the contracts. The amount of money being spent was like nothing anyone had ever seen before. Between 1940 and 1945, the government signed contracts for $50 billion in aid to its allies. Billions more went to factories here at home. In Washington state alone, the contracts for airplanes and ships in 1943 and 1944 were worth 3 times more than all the manufacturing in the entire state just 5 years earlier. Seattle became one of the top 3 cities in the nation for war contracts per person. Those contracts made fortunes for some people. Companies like Boeing, Douglas Aircraft, and Bethlehem Steel grew into giants. The shipyards in Philadelphia, Seattle, and San Francisco worked in 3 shifts, all day and all night. The factories in Detroit switched from making cars to making tanks. And every single one of those contracts was negotiated, approved, and managed by a government worker in Washington. And those workers had power. There was a kind of social order to it all. At the very top, you had the generals, the cabinet members, the high-level officials who controlled budgets of billions of dollars. They lived in Georgetown, in townhouses with servants and private gardens. They went to cocktail parties where the defense contractors mixed with senators. They made policy over dinner. Below them were the mid-level managers, the contract officers, the policy analysts. They lived in the new suburbs that were being built in Maryland and Virginia, and they drove their cars to their offices in Foggy Bottom or at the Pentagon. Their work was technical, bureaucratic, but it was essential. They were the ones who handled the paperwork that turned political decisions into real-world logistics. And at the very bottom were the workers nobody saw. The black janitors who swept the 17 miles of hallways in the Pentagon. The white secretaries who typed up contracts until their hands ached. The cafeteria workers who served meals to 32,000 people a day. The telephone operators who handled 200,000 calls every day on 100,000 miles of cable. The mail clerks who sorted papers through pneumatic tube systems, handling more top-secret documents than the Defense Department's first computers ever would. These were the people who made the machine work. Without them, the Pentagon was just a building made of concrete and sand. But they were paid just enough to live on. They lived in overcrowded rooms. They had no job security. When the war was over, most of them would be let go without a second thought. But for a time, in 1943 and 1944, Washington had a hum of purpose about it. The rituals of power were all around you. Every morning, thousands of workers would pour through the entrances of the Pentagon, past the armed guards, and into the maze of hallways. They found their way around by the letters on the rings and the numbers on the corridors. A ring, earring, corridor 4. They learned the 7-minute walks between offices. They ate in segregated cafeterias. The officers ate separately from the enlisted men, and the whites ate separately from the blacks. Downtown, along Constitution Avenue, the old munitions building was still in use, now filled with Navy people. The huge concrete building, with its 8,400 rooms and 9 wings, wouldn't be torn down until 1970. For now, it was just a reminder of the last war, the last emergency, the last promises. The new War Department building in Foggy Bottom, which was finished in 1941 and was supposed to be the new home for the War Department, became the headquarters for the State Department instead. The building was too small for the War Department before it even opened. It showed how fast the government was outgrowing its own plans. All over the city, temporary buildings were popping up like weeds. They lined the National Mall. They filled up any empty piece of land. They were supposed to be temporary, but many of them would still be standing decades later. They were ugly, functional buildings that the preservationists hated. But they held the government workers who managed the biggest military-industrial complex in human history. And the money just kept coming. War production hit its peak in 1944. The factories were turning out bombers, battleships, rifles, ammunition, jeeps, rations, uniforms. The supply lines stretched across oceans. The logistics of it all were mind-boggling. Coordinating thousands of ships, millions of tons of cargo, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and all of it was managed from Washington. The city became a symbol of American power, of its industrial strength, of a democracy fighting against tyranny. Roosevelt put it in those words, calling it the arsenal of democracy, fighting for freedom. But there was another story under all that talk. It was also a story about profit. The defense contractors made billions. Having political connections was what determined who got the contracts. There was corruption everywhere, but it was rarely punished. After all, there was a war on. Being efficient was more important than being ethical. It was a story of segregation. Black workers built the Pentagon, they cleaned its floors and served its meals, and then they went home to alley dwellings that had no plumbing. It was a story of gender. Women did essential work in the offices, but they were treated with suspicion and faced discrimination when they tried to find a place to live. It was a story of displacement. Whole communities like Queen City were wiped off the map to make way for the machinery of war. And it was a story of power being gathered into one place. The Pentagon wasn't just a headquarters. It was a monument to centralized control, to the idea that all the decisions, all the strategy, all the coordination should come from one massive building, controlled by the federal government. This was Washington in what some called its golden years. Not golden because everyone was prosperous. They weren't. It was golden because it was at the center of the world. Because every important decision about the war passed through these buildings, these offices, these hallways. But golden years have to end. The war ended in 1945. The soldiers came home. The factories switched back to making other things. The temporary housing started to empty out. At least some of it did. The population of Washington, D.C. hit its highest point in 1950 at around 800,000. Then it started to go down as people moved out to the suburbs. White, middle-class families moved to Maryland and Virginia, buying houses with FHA-backed loans. New highways made it easy to commute. The center of the city began to feel empty. But the federal government, it never got smaller. The Pentagon was still there. The State Department stayed in Foggy Bottom. The bureaucracy just grew. They created new departments. The Department of Defense in 1949, which replaced the old War Department. The CIA in 1947. The National Security Council in 1947. The Cold War meant the country had to stay on a permanent war footing. The machinery that was built for war became the machinery of peacetime. Today, Washington, D.C. is one of the wealthiest metropolitan areas in the United States. The median household income in the D.C. area is over $100,000. In Arlington, Virginia, where the Pentagon is, it's over $120,000. Foggy Bottom, which used to be a neighborhood of factories and pawn shops, now has some of the most expensive homes in the country. Houses in Georgetown sell for millions. The city's economy is built on government contracts. Defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, General Dynamics all have their headquarters or big offices in the D.C. suburbs. They employ thousands of people. They bid on Pentagon contracts that are worth billions. There's a revolving door between the military leadership and the defense industry. Generals retire and become consultants for these companies. Government workers leave their jobs to become lobbyists, trying to influence their old colleagues. This is what they call the Beltway. It's the world of government, contractors, lobbyists, and think tanks that surrounds Washington. It's a closed world, it takes care of its own, and it's enormously profitable for the people inside it. But the inequality is still there. Washington, D.C. has one of the biggest gaps between the rich and the poor of any major American city. The wealthy neighborhoods west of Rock Creek Park, places like Georgetown, Cleveland Park, Chevy Chase, are almost all white, rich, and politically connected. The neighborhoods east of the Anacostia River are almost all black, with lower incomes, and politically left out. This division is not an accident. It's the legacy of the housing policies from the 1940s, of redlining, segregated public housing, and FHA discrimination. The wealth gap that was created in that decade has only grown with each generation. The Pentagon is still standing, now surrounded by 200 acres of perfectly kept lawn. It's been renovated, modernized, made stronger after the 9/11 attacks. It is still the world's largest office building. Over 23,000 people work there, managing a Defense Department budget that is more than $800 billion a year. That's more than the next 10 countries combined spend on their militaries. The contracts are still given out. The revolving door is still turning. The power is still concentrated there. Washington today is a monument to what was built in the 1940s. A centralized military and government machine that never stood down. A city that went from being a sleepy southern town to the nerve center of an empire in less than 10 years. A model of public-private partnership, if by partnership you mean the government spends the money and private companies make the profit. And underneath it all, the same pattern is still there. The invisible labor is what keeps the machine running. Janitors, cafeteria workers, security guards, clerical staff. Many of them are black, many are immigrants. Most are paid low wages and have few benefits. The buildings have changed, the technology has advanced, but the structure is the same. So what does Washington, D.C. in the 1940s tell us about the United States? It tells us that a crisis creates opportunities for the people who are in a position to take them. The war emergency was the reason for massive and rapid government spending, but that money wasn't spread around evenly. The defense contractors got rich. White workers got jobs and houses. Black workers were segregated and pushed to the margins. It tells us that power concentrates. The Pentagon wasn't just efficient, it was a symbol. One building, one command structure, one bureaucracy to manage a global war. After 1945, that concentration of power never went away. The national security state that was born in World War II became a permanent part of our lives. It tells us that segregation was a policy, not an accident. Federal agencies deliberately designed housing programs to separate the races and to keep black families from the opportunities to build wealth. This wasn't just Southern racism overriding enlightened Northern values. This was Washington, the capital itself, writing discrimination into its laws. It tells us that labor is invisible until you can't find enough of it. During the war, the government girls were celebrated for a little while. Then the war ended, the men came home, and the women were expected to go back to being housewives. The black workers who built the Pentagon were never celebrated at all. They were erased from the story. It tells us that America worships efficiency and size. The largest office building in the world. 16 months from the first shovel of dirt to completion. 14,000 men working around the clock. The numbers are big, they're impressive, they're meant to make you feel a sense of awe. But they hide the human cost, the displacement, the overcrowding, the exploitation. And it tells us that money and power can't be separated in American life. In the 1940s, Washington became the capital of an empire because it became the capital of contracts. Billions of dollars in war spending flowed through the offices of the Pentagon, through the hands of contract negotiators, through the channels of bureaucracy. That money created fortunes. It built the suburbs. It paid for the rise of a military-industrial complex that, as President Eisenhower warned us in 1961, would grow to dominate American political life. But there's a hard truth in all of this. For many Americans, this system worked. The suburbs that were built with FHA loans in the 40s and 50s became the engines of middle-class wealth. The white families who bought homes for twice the national average income in 1950 saw the value of those homes multiply 10, 20, 50 times over. That equity paid for retirements, for college educations, for starting businesses. The black families who were shut out of those same programs gained none of that wealth. Today, the average black family has about 5% of the wealth of the average white family. It's not because black Americans earn that much less. The income ratio is closer to 60%. It's because wealth builds on itself and getting a head start matters. Washington, D.C. is a monument to that head start. If you walk through Georgetown today, past the townhouses that cost millions of dollars, you are walking through the accumulated wealth that comes from being close to the government. If you walk through Anacostia, past the public housing projects and the corner stores, you are walking through the legacy of being excluded. Both of those neighborhoods were shaped by decisions that were made back in the 1940s. And both of them are quintessentially American. The Pentagon still stands on the Virginia side of the Potomac. Five-sided, low to the ground, you can't mistake it. 17.5 miles of hallways, 4,200 clocks, 284 restrooms. A building so big you can walk for 7 minutes and still be inside it. Across the river, the monuments are gleaming. The Capitol Dome catches the light. The Smithsonian Museum's line the mall where the temporary buildings once stood. Washington has been cleaned up, made beautiful, restored to the vision of the old city plan. The alleys are gone. The boarding houses have become condominiums. The segregation is unofficial now, not written in law. It's polite, invisible, hidden in property values and school district lines. But the machine that was built in the 1940s is still humming along. The defense budget still gets bigger. The contracts still get handed out. The Beltway still turns. And every year, new people pour into Washington, looking for government jobs, positions with contractors, lobbying work. The housing shortage of the past has been replaced by a housing crisis of affordability. Young professionals pay $2,000 for a studio apartment, priced out by the lawyers and the consultants. The names of things change. The technology gets more advanced. But the structure holds. This is the city that was built on war contracts and fear. A city that learned it could profit from an emergency. A city that gathered power to itself and never let it go. A city that promised equality while writing segregation into its laws. A city that celebrates monuments to democracy while the Pentagon, made of concrete, functional, and vast, quietly manages the business of empire. And if you want to understand America, you have to understand this. The transformation of Washington in the 1940s was not an exception. It was a blueprint.